My mother-in-law erased my son from the family tree, so I made her forget the forest even existed. It wasn't a crime you could report to the police. There's no penal code for the theft of a soul, no felony charge for annihilating a child's history. What she did, it was quieter, cleaner, the kind of violence that doesn't leave a bruise, only a hollow space where a life used to be. And the law, in all its majestic impotence, could only offer money as a balm. But you can't sue a ghost, and she had made my husband a ghost. She had made my son a phantom. And me? She made me a liar, a footnote in a story she was determined to rewrite. Before all this, before the quiet rooms and the cold resolve, my life was built on the sanctity of the record. I'm an archivist. Or I was. My work was a conversation with the dead, a promise to the past that it wouldn't be forgotten. I lived in a world of tangible truths, the brittle edge of a 19th century land grant, the faint scent of perfume still clinging to a love letter from 1912, the specific weight of a Civil War daguerreotype in my gloved hand. These things were real, immutable. They were the anchors that held the present in place. My husband, David, understood this. He was born into it. He was a living piece of the history I studied, the latest entry in a long and storied lineage. His family's home, the sprawling New England manor where he grew up and where we eventually lived, wasn't just a house. It was an archive, a museum of itself. Generations of lives were cataloged in its walls, in the stern, oil-painted faces of ancestors, in the silverware that bore the crest of a family that had outlasted empires. David loved it, but he wore its history lightly, like a comfortable old coat. He saw the past not as a burden to be worshipped, but as the foundation upon which we could build something new. Our love story was its own perfect document. We met in a university library, two people who preferred the company of the long gone to the chattering of the present. He was researching his family's involvement in the maritime trade. I was restoring a collection of water-damaged colonial maps. He smelled of old books and cloves. He told me that history wasn't just about facts and dates. It was about empathy. The ability to feel the hope or the fear of someone who lived 200 years ago. In that moment, I knew our life together felt curated in the best way. We built a world within those old stone walls that was ours alone. It was a place of quiet mornings, the scent of coffee mixing with the smell of beeswax used to polish the ancient floors. It was long afternoons spent in the gardens, watching our son, Elijah, chase butterflies, his laughter echoing in a space that was more accustomed to reverent silence. Elijah was our future, the next page in a book we were writing together. He had my curiosity and David's kind eyes. He was proof that the past and present could create something beautiful. He was the living, breathing continuation of the story. And then there was Patricia, David's mother, the keeper of the flame, the chief curator of the family legacy. To the outside world, she was a pillar of the community, a living monument to tradition and old money grace. She moved with a silent, regal authority. Her voice was always soft, her words precisely chosen. But her softness was the deceptive quiet of a winter frost, beautiful from a distance, but deadly up close. Her fatal flaw, the crack in her porcelain facade, was a simple, terrifying conviction. Her memory was the only official record. If she remembered an event a certain way, that was how it happened. If she chose to forget something, it ceased to exist. Her perception wasn't a point of view. It was reality itself, and she was the sole editor. She never approved of me. I wasn't a flaw in her carefully constructed world. I was a bibliographic error. I didn't come from the right kind of family, the right kind of money. I was a cataloger of other people's histories, not an heir to one of my own. My love for the past was academic, not ancestral. An interesting hobby, she once called it. Like needlepoint. She tolerated me because David loved me. But her tolerance felt like a temporary exhibit, one she could dismantle at any time. Her cruelty was never overt. It was in the details. The archival work of a master manipulator. She would tell a story about David's childhood and conveniently omit the part I was in. She'd compliment a dress I was wearing by saying how brave it was for someone with my complexion to wear such a bold color. She would hold my son, her grandson, on her lap, and her touch was so formal, so distant. It was like she was handling a fragile museum piece she'd rather have kept under glass. Her daughter, Heather, was her acolyte. Her shadow. Heather, 42 and perpetually disappointed, had spent her life orbiting her mother's gravitational pull. The love David and I shared was a constant stinging rebuke to her own loveless strategic marriage. My happiness was an affront to her, so she became Patricia's amplifier, her whisper network. If Patricia planted a seed of doubt, Heather was the one who watered it, tended it, and made sure it grew into a thicket of insidious rumors. They were a united front of quiet, dismissive poison. David's death was sudden. An aneurysm. A silent, brutal thief in the night. One moment he was sleeping beside me, the next he was a part of the history he so loved. The silence he left behind was a physical presence. It filled every room, every hallway. The house was no longer a home. It was a mausoleum again, and in that suffocating silence, Patricia began her work. The first cuts were small. So small you'd think you were imagining them. At the wake, held in the grand ballroom of the estate, she'd regale guests with stories of David. But her anecdotes were edited. The trip to Italy David and I took for our 5th anniversary became a solo trip he took to find himself. A photograph of the 3 of us on Elijah's first birthday, one of my most treasured possessions, vanished from the mantelpiece. When I asked about it, Heather just smiled that thin, pitying smile of hers and said, "Oh, Mom probably just put it away for safekeeping." Things get so disorganized with so many people around. It was never returned. Heather started her own campaign. Whispers to old family friends about how I was not coping well, how I was fragile and prone to fantasy. She was laying the groundwork, preparing the battlefield, and I, in my fog of grief, didn't even see the armies gathering. I was a widow mourning my husband. I didn't realize I was a target. I thought this was their clumsy, cold way of dealing with grief. I didn't understand that they weren't mourning a loss. They were seizing an opportunity. The final, definitive act of erasure came 2 months later. The reading of the will. We were gathered in the family lawyer's office, a room that smelled of furniture polish and unresolved disputes. I remember the rhythmic drone of Mr. Abernathy's voice as he read through the legal boilerplate. Elijah was fidgeting beside me, his little legs swinging back and forth, not understanding the gravity of the moment. He just knew his father was gone and the world had become a quiet, confusing place. Abernathy cleared his throat. "And to my beloved son, Elijah James Abbott," he read, "I bequeath the contents of the trust established by my grandfather, to be managed by my wife, Jessica Abbott, until his 25th birthday." A small gasp. It wasn't me. It was Heather. Patricia held up a single pale hand. The lawyer stopped reading. The silence in the room was absolute. She turned her head slowly, not to the lawyer, but to me. Her eyes were not angry. They were not sad. They were clear, like a scientist looking at a specimen. "There must be a mistake," she said, her voice as calm and cool as Riverstone. Mr. Abernathy blinked. "A mistake, Patricia? I assure you David was very clear in his instructions." "No, not with the document," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "With the premise." She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle on us all. Then she looked past me, her gaze landing on my 9-year-old son. "That boy," she declared, the words dropping like ice chips into the silence, "cannot be my grandson." The air left my lungs. The world tilted. I could feel Elijah press closer to me, sensing the sudden shift in the room's climate. I started to speak, but no words came out, just a dry clicking sound in my throat. Patricia continued, her voice gaining strength, the voice of someone delivering a well-rehearsed, indisputable truth. "David was my son. I knew him better than anyone. He was sensitive, easily influenced." She finally looked at me, and her expression was one of profound, theatrical disappointment. "He wanted a family so badly he was willing to overlook certain inconsistencies. He chose to believe a story he was told." Mr. Abernathy, flustered, stammered, "Patricia, what are you implying?" "I am not implying anything, Franklin. she said, her tone sharp, final. I am stating a fact. A fact my poor son was too gentle to confront. She stood up, the picture of a grieved matriarchy. Heather rose with her, a loyal lady-in-waiting. Elijah bears no resemblance to our family. None whatsoever. We have always known this. We simply chose to keep a dignified silence out of respect for David's feelings. It was a masterpiece of cruelty. In less than a minute, she had posthumously painted her own son as a fool, a cuckold. She had branded me an adulteress, a liar, a gold digger. And my son, who was still warm from my touch, who had his father's cowlick and his grandfather's smile if you only cared to look. She had declared him a bastard, a fraud. She formally, publicly, disowned a 9-year-old child. She had taken the most sacred document of our life together, our love, our family, and declared it a forgery. I don't remember leaving the office. I remember the feeling of Elijah's small hand in mine, gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. I remember the looks on the faces in the waiting room as we walked past, the pity, the suspicion, the faint, delicious scent of scandal. Patricia's version of the story had been published. The first edition was already in circulation. By the time we reached the car, my reality had been completely replaced by her fiction. I wasn't just a widow, I was an outcast. And my son's identity, his birthright, his entire history, had been stolen. Of course, I went to a lawyer. A different one. A sharp woman with a steel gray bob and an office that overlooked the city. She listened patiently, her face a mask of professional empathy. She explained the legal pathways. We could file a petition, demand a paternity test, sue for defamation. We could, in her words, fight this. And I knew, even in my grief-addled state, that we would win. A simple DNA test would prove Elijah was David's son. Science would validate my truth. The court would award Elijah his inheritance. On paper, justice would be served. But Patricia wasn't fighting on paper. She was fighting in the real world, the world of whispers and reputations, of social clubs and charity boards. A world where the truth is whatever the most powerful people agree it is. A lawsuit would take years. It would be a public spectacle. Patricia's lawyers, a team of smiling sharks from a firm that had represented the family for a century, would drag me through hell. They would leak stories to the press. They would question my character, my sanity. They would put my grief on trial. The narrative would be cemented. Greedy, unstable widow tries to swindle venerable family. And even when the DNA results came in, that would just be a postscript. The headline would already be written. The law could give me money. It could restore my son's access to a trust fund. But it couldn't force Patricia to look my son in the eye and admit she was wrong. It couldn't prosecute the quiet, venomous cruelty of what she did. It couldn't restore a 9-year-old boy's faith in the world. It couldn't give him back his grandmother, his aunt, his history. The legal system offered a transaction. I needed a reckoning. That's when I understood. Justice wasn't something a judge could grant me. It was something I would have to create. Patricia's weapon was the manipulation of memory, the curation of a false reality. She had used her power as the family historian to delete my son from the record. So be it. I was an archivist. I knew how to handle a corrupted document. You don't just correct the error. You deconstruct the entire text. You expose the forgery for all to see. You find the original manuscript and you restore it, page by painful page. My grief was a fog. For months I wandered through it, lost. But her cruelty, her absolute, calculated violence, that was a lighthouse. It cut through the haze and showed me the shore. It gave me a direction, a purpose. I stopped crying. I started planning. She had attacked me in my area of expertise, history, memory, truth, a fatal miscalculation on her part. She thought she was the sole author of her family's story. She was about to learn that every archive has a new archivist. Eventually. And I am very, very good at my job. I would not be rewriting history. I would be correcting it. And her mind, her precious, authoritative memory, would be my first acquisition. She built her kingdom on the foundations of a shared past. She believed her memory was the bedrock of that kingdom. But memory is not stone. It is parchment, and I was about to show her how easily it could be altered, rewritten, and burned. Before we continue, you need to understand where we began. My husband David was gone. In his place was a void, and in that void his mother Patricia planted a poisoned tree. She stood before our family and declared that my son, her grandson, was an imposter. That my marriage was a lie. With a few chosen words, she didn't just disinherit a 9-year-old boy, she unpersoned him. She deleted him from the official record and, in doing so, tried to delete me. I was an archivist, a keeper of history, and she had burned my most precious collection. The law offered me a settlement, a financial transaction to soothe a spiritual wound. But I wasn't interested in reparations. I was interested in restitution. I decided that if she was going to be the author of a grand fiction, I would become its editor. I resolved to use my skills not to fight her in a courtroom, but in the only place that mattered, inside the archive of her own mind. The first step in any restoration project is to secure your primary source. The one, undeniable piece of evidence upon which all other truths will be rebuilt. For me, that was DNA. It was the bedrock. The scientific, irrefutable fact that would anchor my entire operation. Getting it wasn't cinematic. There was no breaking into a high-tech lab. It was pathetic and sad. I went to the estate under the pretense of collecting the last of David's things from his old study, a room Patricia had kept preserved like a shrine since his death. She watched me from the doorway, her eyes like a hawk's. She thought I was overcome with sentimentality. In reality, I was hunting. I needed a clean sample, something untainted. I found it woven into the collar of his favorite jacket. A single strand of hair, dark, with a hint of auburn in the light, just like Elijah's. I plucked it with a pair of tweezers I'd brought in my purse, sealed it in a small plastic envelope, and hid it in my palm. The whole time I let the tears fall. They weren't entirely fake. I was mourning the man whose memory I was about to weaponize. It felt like a desecration, the first of many. The wait for the results was the longest 2 weeks of my life. It was a period of forced stillness. I couldn't plan my next move until my foundational truth was confirmed. In those 2 weeks, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I'd watch Elijah sleep, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his ear, looking for the ghost of his father in his face. What if I was wrong? What if, in some impossible cosmic twist, Patricia was right? The thought was a sliver of ice in my gut. It would mean that my entire life, my love, my son, was the lie she claimed it was. It would mean I was insane. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. The subject line was clinical. Case number 734B results. My hands shook so badly I could barely click the mouse. I opened the attached PDF. It was a sterile document, all numbers and percentages and scientific jargon. But at the bottom, in plain, beautiful English, were the words, "The alleged father, David Abbott, cannot be excluded as the biological father of the child, Elijah Abbott. The probability of paternity is 99.999%. I wept. I put my head down on my cheap apartment desk and I sobbed. Not for David, not for myself, but for the sheer, brutal weight of the truth. It was real. I wasn't crazy. My son was who I knew he was. My love was what I knew it was. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical pain. But as I read the report again, my eyes caught something else. The lab, as part of their standard process for familial inheritance cases, had also tested the sample against DNA I had provided for Heather's 2 children, procured from the toothbrushes they'd left at the house months ago during a sleepover. It was a long shot, a piece of due diligence my lawyer had suggested. I hadn't thought anything of it, but there it was. A second table, a second conclusion. Based on the analysis of the STR loci, the alleged paternal aunt, Heather Croft, is excluded from being the biological aunt of child A and child B. The probability of kinship is 0%. I read it once, twice, 10 times. The words swam before my eyes. Heather's children were not Abbott's. Her husband was not their father. They were the product of an affair. I felt a dizzying, vertiginous rush. The world had just cracked open beneath my feet. This wasn't just a piece of evidence anymore. It was a bomb. My plan had been to correct a single entry in the family ledger. Now I had the power to burn the entire book. My son Elijah, the boy Patricia had cast out as a fraud, was not just an heir. He was the only true biological heir to the family name. The irony was so potent, so Shakespearean, it was almost poetic. Patricia, in her obsessive quest to protect the purity of her bloodline, had disowned the only person who truly belonged to it. That was my midpoint revelation. The moment the archivist became an arsonist, my objective shifted. It was no longer enough to be let back in. I needed to take control of the entire archive. My next meeting with Patricia was not in a lawyer's office. It was on her turf. I requested a private audience at the estate. I walked into the grand sitting room, the same room where she'd held the wake and systematically edited me out of her anecdotes, and I felt nothing. The grief was gone, calcified into something harder, colder. She sat in her usual wingback chair by the fire, a queen on her throne. Heather stood dutifully behind her, a pale imitation of her mother's steel. "What is this, Jessica?" Patricia asked, her voice dripping with weary condescension. "If it's another plea from your lawyer, you can give it to the butler on your way out." "It's not from my lawyer," I said, my voice calm, even. "It's a historical document. I thought, as the family's primary historian, you'd want to see it." She didn't move. Heather, however, took the bait. She snatched the envelope and pulled out the lab reports. I watched her face as she scanned the first page, the one confirming Elijah's paternity. Her expression tightened, a flicker of annoyance. This was a problem, but a manageable one. A legal hurdle. Then she turned to the second page. The change was fascinating to watch. It was like seeing a statue erode in seconds. The color drained from her face. Her mouth opened slightly. The papers trembled in her hand. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful. "Mother," she whispered, unable to say more. Patricia snatched the papers from her daughter's hand. She read them, her brow furrowed in concentration. She read them again. The silence in the room was thick, heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. When she finally looked up at me, the mask was gone. For the first time, I saw her not as a matriarch, not as a monster, but as a terrified old woman who had just realized her entire world was a house of cards. This was the critical moment. I could have threatened her. I could have laid out my demands. But that would have been an act of war. I was planning an infiltration. So I did the opposite. I offered her grace. A poisoned grace, but grace nonetheless. "I don't want to destroy this family," I said softly, my voice filled with a carefully rehearsed empathy. "I know you were acting out of a place of grief and a desire to protect your family's legacy. You made a mistake. A terrible, painful mistake. But it doesn't have to be a public one." She stared at me, her mind racing, calculating the angles. "Imagine the scandal, Patricia," I continued, my voice a gentle murmur. "Imagine what this would do to Heather's life. To your grandchildren, who have grown up believing they are Abbotts. Imagine the headlines. It would be the end of everything you've spent your life preserving." Heather started to sob quietly. A pathetic, whimpering sound. "Here is what I propose," I said, leaning forward, my tone confessional. "We correct the record, quietly. You made a terrible error in judgment, clouded by grief. But now, with a clear head, you have seen the truth. You will welcome your only true grandson, Elijah, back into the family. You will restore him to his rightful place. And this unfortunate information about Heather's children, remains a family secret, preserved in the family vault. No one ever has to know. It was the perfect trap. I wasn't blackmailing her with the truth. I was offering her a lie, a chance to save face, to maintain her precious public image, to protect her daughter. The price was simply accepting my son, to let us back inside the walls. She was cornered. To refuse was to face total public annihilation. To accept was to hand me the keys to her kingdom. She looked at her weeping daughter, then back at me. Her jaw was tight, her eyes burning with a hatred so profound it was almost elemental. But she nodded. A single sharp, jerky motion. "Fine," she hissed. The next day, Elijah and I moved back into the estate. Patricia had spun a tale for the staff and the few family members who mattered about a misunderstanding and a joyful reconciliation. I was no longer the outcast. I was the magnanimous daughter-in-law, the forgiving victim who had graciously allowed the matriarch to correct her grief-stricken error. I was a saint, and from within the hallowed walls of the archive I could finally begin my work. My first 2 weeks were purely observational. I was an archivist assessing a new collection. I walked through every room, every hallway, every forgotten corner of that house, and I didn't just look. I memorized. I cataloged the reality Patricia inhabited. The precise angle of the Ming vase in the foyer. The specific order of the silver-framed photographs on the grand piano. The faint water stain on the ceiling of the morning room, shaped vaguely like the coast of Maine. I noted which floorboards creaked, the scent of lavender and mothballs in the linen closet, the way the late afternoon sun hit the dust motes in the library. I was building a complete three-dimensional map of her world in my mind. At night, I delved into the real archives. The house had a records room in the basement, a climate-controlled vault filled with generations of letters, diaries, ledgers, and photographs. Patricia saw it as a reliquary. I saw it as an armory. I spent hours down there, a single lamp casting a pool of light on the table, wearing white cotton gloves, carefully turning brittle pages. I was cross-referencing Patricia's well-worn family stories, the grand, heroic myths she told at every dinner party, with the actual, documented truth. And the discrepancies were breathtaking. The great-grandfather who she claimed was a war hero, a notarized letter revealed he'd paid a substitute to fight for him in the Civil War. The romantic tale of her parents' whirlwind courtship? Her mother's diary was filled with agonizing entries about being trapped in a loveless, arranged marriage. Her entire identity, the grand narrative of her family she had built and curated, was as much a fiction as her claims about my son. She wasn't preserving history. She was a propagandist, and I had just acquired her sources. The campaign began with changes so small they would live in the periphery of her consciousness. The goal of the first phase was not to make her feel attacked, but to make her feel unreliable, to introduce a subtle static into the clear broadcast of her reality. I started with the objects. One of her prized possessions was a collection of 18th-century porcelain dolls, kept in a glass cabinet in the parlor. One morning, before she came downstairs, I moved the doll on the far left to the far right. That was it. Later that day, I saw her walk past the cabinet, pause, and frown. A tiny flicker of confusion. She opened the cabinet, stared at the dolls for a full minute, then closed it and walked away, shaking her head slightly, as if to clear it. She didn't say a word. The seed of doubt had been planted. If she had mentioned it, I was prepared. Elijah and I had rehearsed. "What doll, Grandma?" "It's always been on that side." A few days later, I adjusted the massive, dour portrait of her grandfather that hung in the main hall. I tilted it just 1 degree to the left. It was enough to be wrong, but not enough to be obvious. It would catch the corner of your eye. For the rest of the week, I watched her walk past it, pausing each time, her head cocked, a look of vague irritation on her face. It was a maddening low-grade hum of wrongness that she couldn't quite identify. My masterpiece of this phase was the teacups. Patricia had a particular set of heirloom china she used for her afternoon tea. Royal Doulton, hand-painted. I spent 3 weeks and a considerable amount of David's life insurance money commissioning a flawless set of replicas. They were perfect in every visual detail, but I had them made with a slightly different ceramic composite. They were, to the gram, 5% lighter than the originals. One evening, I swapped them. The next afternoon, I watched from the doorway as the maid served her tea. Patricia picked up the cup, and her hand rose just a fraction of an inch higher than she expected. It was an infinitesimal, almost comical little jerk. Her face registered a split second of pure, unadulterated confusion. She looked at the cup. She looked at her hand. She put it down. She picked it up again. She knew on some deep somatic level that something was profoundly wrong, but she couldn't articulate what it was. Her own body, her muscle memory was betraying her. When she mentioned it to Heather over the phone later, her voice a tight knot of frustration, I overheard her say, "It just felt flimsy." Heather, of course, had no idea what she was talking about. From the outside, it sounded like madness. Phase 2 was about weaponizing the truth I'd found in the archives. I began to gently, innocently correct her. I was no longer the silent, grieving widow. I was the helpful, inquisitive daughter-in-law, the fellow historian. We were at dinner. She was launching into her favorite story about her grandfather, the supposed war hero, building his shipping empire from nothing, a tale of grit and American ingenuity. I waited for her to finish, then I smiled warmly. "That's such a powerful story, Patricia," I said. "It's amazing what you can learn in the archives, though." I was reading his journals the other day, and I found the original bill of sale for the company. It looks like his father gifted it to him as a wedding present. He never worked a day on the docks in his life. Isn't it funny how stories evolve over time? How families create their own mythology? It's really quite fascinating from an archival perspective. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. The look she gave me was glacial. "I think I know my own family's history, Jessica." "Of course," I said, my voice all deference and respect. "I must have misread it. My apologies. Memory is such a funny, fickle thing, isn't it?" I did it again a week later. She was telling Elijah about the grand romance of her parents. I chimed in. "Oh, I found her diary. It was tucked away in a hat box. So beautifully written. All those entries about how desperately she wanted to be a painter in Paris, but was forced to marry for social standing. Such a tragic romantic figure." Each correction was a small paper cut, each one delivered with a smile and a tone of scholarly curiosity. I was dismantling her life's work, her entire identity, piece by piece, fact by verifiable fact, and I was doing it under the guise of being helpful. She couldn't accuse me of anything. I was just sharing what I'd found in her family's records. I was holding up a mirror, and she was horrified by the reflection. The narrative was slipping from her grasp. She was no longer the sole curator of the past. She had a rival, but this all took a toll. The constant performance was exhausting. The vigilance, the meticulous planning, the doublethink. And the darkest part of it was my son. I had to bring Elijah into the conspiracy. I didn't tell him the whole truth, of course. He was only 9. I framed it as a game. "Grandma is a little forgetful these days," I'd tell him. "Sometimes she gets confused about where things are. So if she asks you, the doll has always been on the right side of the cabinet. Okay? We're just helping her remember." He was a child. He wanted to please me. He played his part perfectly. But one night, as I was tucking him into bed, he looked at me with David's earnest, searching eyes and asked, "Mommy, why are we lying to Grandma? Lying is wrong. Daddy said so." That was my low point. The moment I looked in the mirror and saw a flicker of Patricia's reflection. Her tool was the lie. And now it was mine. I was using my son, my beautiful innocent son, as a pawn in this ugly, twisted game. I was poisoning him with the same deceit I was trying to punish. The weight of that realization almost broke me. For a whole week I stopped. I couldn't continue. I sat in my room staring out the window, wondering if I had become the monster. I thought about just leaving, taking the DNA test, going public, and burning the whole rotten structure to the ground. Let the world see them for what they were, but I knew that would be my defeat, not hers. Public shame is temporary. The headlines would fade. What I was doing, what I was building, was permanent. I wasn't just destroying her past. I was destroying her belief in her own present. It was a terrible, unforgivable thing to do to another human being. But she had done it to a child. To my child. She had tried to annihilate his reality. So no, I would not stop. I would see it through. But that night, holding my son's question in my heart, I knew that whatever peace I might find at the end of this road, a piece of my own soul would be the price of admission. I was no longer just correcting the record. I was corrupting myself. I had almost lost my nerve, brought to the edge by the reflection of my own monstrousness. But looking at my son's face, I knew I couldn't stop. She started this war when she tried to erase him, and I would be the one to finish it, no matter what it cost me. To win a war, you must first control the terrain. My enemy's terrain was her own mind, her belief in the infallibility of her memory. I began my campaign with small incursions, moving a doll, tilting a portrait, commissioning replica teacups that felt subtly wrong in her hand. I introduced a low hum of static into her reality, making her doubt her own senses. Then I began to correct the official record, using her own family archives to dismantle the myths she had built her life upon. I had the ultimate weapon, a DNA test that proved not only that my son, Elijah, was David's, but that her daughter Heather's children were not. Elijah was her sole biological heir. Armed with this, I forced my way back into the house under the guise of forgiveness. But the work took its toll. Using my son as a pawn in this game of lies nearly broke me. For a moment, I saw my own reflection in the monster I was fighting, but the memory of what she tried to do to my son, the memory of her trying to unperson him, was a cold, hard stone in my gut. It steadied me. I knew then that I would see this through to the end, no matter the cost to my own soul. My moment of weakness passed. It receded like a tide, leaving behind a shoreline of hard, jagged resolve. I had seen the abyss in myself, and I had not blinked. That clarity changed the nature of the campaign. The final push would not be about subtlety. The foundation was cracked. Now it was time to bring the whole rotten edifice down. The house had become a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken truths and simmering paranoia. Patricia was no longer just confused. She was becoming frantic. Her world was betraying her in small, maddening ways, and she knew on some primal level that I was the cause. But she couldn't prove it. Her attempts to catch me became desperate and clumsy. One morning, I found a single grain of rice placed on the corner of a book on her nightstand. A primitive trap, I smiled. I didn't touch the book. Instead, I went into her bathroom and swapped her expensive French-milled soap with an identical-looking bar of cheap glycerin. I left the grain of rice where it was. Let her think she was winning that battle while she was losing the war. She started talking to herself, muttering as she walked the halls, touching the walls as if to confirm they were still real. Heather was a ghost, pale and silent, trapped between her mother's escalating madness and the silent, ever-present threat of my knowledge. She would watch me at the dinner table, her eyes pleading. Pleading for what? For mercy? For me to stop? She had stood by her mother's side when they cast my son into the darkness. There was no mercy left for her. The final confrontation had to be perfect. It couldn't just be between me and her. An accusation in private is just a shouting match. For the record to be truly, permanently corrected, there had to be a witness. An official observer. I arranged for Mr. Abernathy, the family lawyer, to come to the estate for dinner, under the pretense of discussing the administration of Elijah's trust, now that we were all reconciled. He was a man who dealt in facts and evidence, a creature of the documented world. He was the perfect audience. That evening, the air in the dining room was so tense you could taste it. It tasted like metal. Patricia sat at the head of the long, polished table, a parody of her former regal self. Her hands trembled slightly. She kept glancing at the silverware, the water glasses, the portrait of her scowling grandfather on the wall, as if expecting them to betray her at any moment. Heather picked at her food, her face ashen. Elijah, whom I had instructed to be on his absolute best behavior, was a portrait of quiet innocence. And Mr. Abernathy, bless his dry, legalistic heart, tried to make small talk, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting on a fault line. It was the salt shaker that finally broke her. I had replaced the sterling silver shaker, a heavy, ornate piece, with a flawless replica made of plated nickel. It was 30 grams lighter. Patricia reached for it, her hand closing around it. And then she froze. Her whole body went rigid. She lifted it, her expression one of dawning, hysterical horror. She looked at it as if it were a venomous snake. "It's wrong," she whispered, her voice a ragged, choked sound. Mr. Abernathy paused, a piece of roast beef halfway to his mouth. "Pardon, Patricia?" "The salt," she shrieked, slamming it down on the table. The noise made everyone jump. "It's wrong. It's light. It's a fake." Heather put her face in her hands. "Mother, please," she mumbled into her palms. "Not now. Don't you mother please me." Patricia snarled, her eyes wild. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "It's her. She's doing it. She's been doing it for weeks." Mr. Abernathy looked from Patricia to me, his face a mask of bewildered concern. I met his gaze and held it, my own expression one of deep, sorrowful worry. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of my head. Patricia was on her feet now, her voice rising to a frantic crescendo. "She moves the dolls. She tilts the paintings. The teacups, Franklin, the teacups feel like paper. She's trying to drive me mad. She's poisoning my house. She's poisoning my mind." She was raving. It was a spectacular, glorious implosion. Everything she had been holding in, all the small, maddening inconsistencies, all the gaslit doubts, came pouring out in a torrent of incoherent accusations. She sounded completely, utterly insane, and in the face of her hysteria, I was a pillar of calm. I waited for her to run out of breath, her chest heaving. The room was deathly silent, save for her ragged gasps. I placed my napkin on the table, my movements slow and deliberate. I looked at Mr. Abernathy, my eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry you have to see this, Franklin," I said, my voice soft, laced with pity. "She's been unwell. Ever since David's passing, she has these episodes. She gets confused. Her memory, it's not what it used to be." "Unwell?" Patricia screamed. "I am not unwell. I am being attacked in my own home." And that's when I turned to her. I looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time, I let her see the truth behind my mask. The pity fell away, and all that was left was the cold, hard, unforgiving ice. The archivist delivering her final damning finding. "Memory is a funny, fickle thing, isn't it, Patricia?" I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it cut through the room like a shard of glass. I leaned forward. Sometimes, when a person tells a lie, a great, monumental lie, they have to pour all their energy into maintaining it. They build walls around it, they rewrite everything to accommodate it. But the truth is heavy. It has weight. And the effort of holding up a lie of that magnitude, eventually it just breaks the mind. I let the words hang in the air. I saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes, the dawning horror as she finally understood the nature of the game I had been playing. She knew that I was talking about Elijah. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked to her daughter, her last ally, her eyes begging for support. "Heather," she croaked. Tell them she's a liar." Heather wouldn't look at her. She just sat there frozen, staring at her plate. A statue of cowardice. Patricia's face crumpled. The last bit of fight went out of her. It was the ultimate betrayal, and it was the final blow. Her own daughter, the one she was trying to protect, had abandoned her to the wolves. But I wasn't finished. There was one last piece of the record to correct. I turned my cool, calm gaze to Heather. "You should have supported your mother just now," I said, my tone conversational, as if commenting on the weather. Mr. Abernathy looked utterly baffled. "You see, Franklin," I said, turning back to him, "Patricia isn't entirely wrong. She has been living in a house of lies. Just not the ones she thinks." I paused, letting the silence stretch. Then I delivered the coup de grace. "Patricia has been laboring under the delusion that her daughter's children are Abbotts," I said, my voice clear and precise. "That she has 2 other heirs to the family name. A delusion that Heather has allowed her to believe for 15 years. The truth, which I discovered some time ago, is that Elijah is, and always has been, Patricia's sole biological grandchild. Her only true heir." The sound Heather made was a strangled gasp. Mr. Abernathy's jaw literally dropped. He stared at Heather, then at Patricia, then back at me, his legal mind struggling to process the sheer layered depravity of it all. "So you see," I concluded, folding my hands on the table, When my mother-in-law stood in your office and tried to erase my son, she was, in fact, erasing the only legitimate heir she had left. An act of historical vandalism so profound it's no wonder her mind couldn't withstand the fallout. It was over. Every lie had been exposed. Every secret brought into the light. Patricia stared at me, her face a blank canvas of shock. Then she looked at Heather with an expression of such pure, venomous hatred that I almost felt a flicker of pity. She had been betrayed by everyone. Her perception, her daughter, her own history. She was utterly, completely alone in a world she no longer recognized. She made a small, wounded sound like an animal, and then her eyes rolled back in her head and she collapsed, sliding from her chair onto the thick Persian rug with a soft, final thud. The aftermath was quiet, clinical. Mr. Abernathy, to his credit, handled everything with grim efficiency. An ambulance was called. Patricia had suffered what the doctors termed a major psychotic break. She was committed to a private facility upstate. She never returned to the house. I'm told she spends her days talking to people who aren't there, convinced the nurses are replacing her things with clever forgeries. She lives in a prison of my own design. Heather vanished. Her husband, when he learned the truth about his children, divorced her with a speed and brutality that was almost impressive. She took the boys and moved somewhere out west. I have never heard from her again, and me? I won. By default, I became the executor of the estate, the steward of the family legacy, the guardian of its sole heir. The house is mine. The history is mine. The silence is mine. I walk these halls, and every object, every portrait, every creaking floorboard is a testament to my victory. I corrected the record. I restored my son to his rightful place. I took everything back. But the question you're supposed to ask at the end of a story like this is, was it worth it? Did it bring me peace? No, peace is a quiet garden. This is a battlefield after the fighting has stopped, littered with the wreckage. There is no peace here. There is only order. The cold, clean satisfaction of a problem solved. An equation balanced. I look at my son and I see a boy whose future is secure. He has a name that is undeniably his. He has wealth. He has status. I gave him back the world that was stolen from him. But what was the lesson I taught him? I showed him that the truth is a weapon, that love can be a liability, that the only real power is control. I protected him by becoming the very thing I despised. I am the new matriarch of this house, the new curator, the new keeper of the flame. I spend my days in this library surrounded by the ghosts of the past, meticulously preserving a history I had to shatter in order to save. I am the archivist of a ruin. I look at my hands, the same hands that once so carefully handled brittle, centuries-old documents, and I see what they've become. The hands of a saboteur, the hands of a liar, the hands of a monster. I started this journey to restore a sacred truth, but to do it, I had to profane everything I believed in. My mother-in-law erased my son from the family tree. So I made her forget the forest even existed. And now, I find myself the lonely warden of the ashes, wondering if I burned down the whole world just to prove a single solitary point.